Hey all, and welcome back to Ascendancy Gaming. I know it's been a long time since I've released a video, but I totally gave up on Neverwinter through boredom. In the last few months I've been playing a bit of Path of Exile, learning the game, how it works, how everything goes together, that sort of thing, and thought I would bring out my first build guide, which is designed to take you from the very start of the game at League start through to end game red maps and start building some currency to either further develop this build or maybe work on a build that isn't a League starter that you need to build up some currency for. So let's start with classes and Ascendancy. So for this class, for me the best to play is Trickster. It's got really good bonuses to damage over time, and also it's got really good effective life and sustain. So we'll run through how you progress once you do your labyrinths and what order to take them in. So the first one I would definitely take is Patient Reaper. It gives us a really big boost early on to both damage and survivability. We'll then move over and take on our second labyrinth, the Ghost Dance. Now this gives us extra evasion and sustain. You won't really see the benefits for this one until later on when you map in and you're a bit higher level, but we need to take it in order to get to our next one, which is Escape Artist. Now this is an incredibly powerful node, and it gives us extra dodge, attack speed, energy shield and evasion, and as you can see from the notes, it gives us bonus energy shield for evasion that we have on a chest piece, and it gives us bonus evasion for energy shield that we have on a helmet. And then finally, for your Uber Lab, you'll go along and take Prolonged Pain, which gives you a boost to chaos and damage over time. Now before we get into the meat and bones of the gear, I just really quickly want to touch on leveling, because I'm sure it's something that people will be interested in. For your leveling gear, you don't need anything other than the gear that you find on the ground. I would use the first bow that you pick up because it's got really quick attack speed, and then once you can unlock Toxic Rain, which is level 12, and then you'll get the support gems a bit later on. I would run with Caustic Arrow until you can pick up Toxic Rain, and then when you can, you want your 4-link to be Toxic Rain, Mirage Archer, Void Manipulation and Vicious Projectiles. And then remember to pick up Malevolent and Flesh and Stone when you can, because this helps with survivability and damage. There will be leveling trees in the path of building linked in the description. There will also be some information in the notes section that just describes a bit more in detail about what gear you can be using. So we'll start with our weapon, which is a unique bow called Quill Rain, which you can equip from level 5. I've had a look on PoE Ninja at all of these items at what they cost at the beginning of the Delirium League to try and give you an idea of what they're going to cost at League start, or at least in the first couple of days. And Quill Rain has always been 1 chaos. I think it was 2 on day 1, and after that it dropped to 1 chaos and it stayed at that amount. Now the reason we're using this bow is it synergizes really well with a lot of the other items that we're going to come onto. But first off, it's got really quick attack speed, and as I say, it's dirt cheap. The attack speed is really important because when we're building this Toxic Rain character, we're not interested in the damage that the bow does or the damage that the actual hit does. We're going to scale up the damage over time that the pods leave on the ground. So the quicker we can attack, the more pods we can get on the ground and the more damage that we can cause over time. So the next item we're going to come on to, which is another mandatory item for this build, but it's not something you need to get straight away, and it's certainly something you can build towards, is the Thieves' Torment Prismatic Ring. Now this is still fairly cheap. It's around 10 to 8 chaos on day 1 of the league, and it quickly drops to about 5 chaos within a couple of days. Now what this ring gives is a huge amount of mana and life gain on hit. It also gives us quite a good chunk of elemental resistances. Now the downside to the ring is you can't wear a second ring and it doesn't have any life on it. But as I say, I've used this ring all the way through endgame to red maps. I've killed Conquerors, I've killed Guardians and everything with this ring. So it's one that we want to use at the end. So if you do find the currency, I would make it one of the first purchases. If you don't have the currency to get it, you can run a mana flask or even 2 mana flasks to sustain the attack speed that we're getting on Quill Rain. So we're now going to move on to the boots. Now the boots that I would recommend for the build, or that I use, are Exili's Step. They are fairly cheap early on at 10 to 15 chaos. The issue with these boots is they drop from normal Exile, so until a lot of players get there, this may hang around the 10 to 15 chaos mark. As soon as people start hitting that Exile, then the price will plummet. So just a normal rare boots with as much movement speed and life and resistance as you can get will be absolutely fine. The reason I like these boots is you get really high movement speed and high evasion. You also get a decent life roll and a really big chunk of chance to dodge spell attacks. There's not much more needed to say about the boots. If you can pick these up, I'll recommend to do it. But my recommendation would be use some rare boots, wait a few days until people start hitting at zero and loads of people are having these drop, and they'll soon sell for a couple of chaos. So there are a few options for helmets. You can always run a rare helmet with high life and elemental resistances. I really like to run Devoto's Devotion for the extra movement speed and attack speed. It has also got really high dex and evasion. It does have its drawbacks. You don't get any life on it, and it is pretty expensive early league. And even after a few days, it still holds its price pretty well. So looking on PoE Ninja, it's 35 to 40 chaos at league start. So it's really hard to recommend because all of our chaos that we earn, we're going to put towards cluster jewels, which we'll come to later. So my other option, which I would use until you've got a bit more currency and you can afford the Devotos without demolishing your bank balance, and that would be Star Conjurer's Head. It's really cheap early on, it's a couple of chaos. Again, similar to Devotos, really high evasion and dexterity. It has got increased attack speed and it has got a life roll. So this is the helmet that I would recommend to start out with. If you want to go a bit more zoom and you get a bit more currency, then by all means go for Devotos. So we're going to move on to the chest piece, and this is a really important item in the build as it makes a lot of the stuff that we put into play work. Good news is it is really cheap. From the very start of the league, it's 1 chaos. You don't really need this to be linked. Your options later on, if a 6-link Quill Rain is expensive, is to pick up a 6-link Restless Ward, because after a few days, they're going to go down to whatever the price of a Divine Orb is. Now there's loads and loads of interesting stats that this item gives us. The first one is if you look at the stats on it, it's got really high evasion and really high energy shield. So that energy shield will obviously go onto our energy shield, and then the evasion, thanks to our Ascendancy Escape Artist, is going to also add extra onto our energy shield. It's also got a really decent life roll, and it comes with benefits of increased duration of charges and also increased movement speed per frenzy charge. Now why this is important is we're going to be manually generating frenzy charges, which we'll come on to later. So the longer that we can keep those charges up without having to manually attack again, the better quality of life it is. So once you get your 5 frenzy charges and the nodes that go to it that give extra duration, I think it's around 22 seconds that you'll have frenzy charges up for. So every 20 seconds basically you have to unload a barrage of frenzy onto an enemy and you'll be back to max frenzy charges. So for our gloves and quiver, it's as simple as picking up items with high life roll, resistances, and if you can, attack speed. This is also a good place to try and add stats if you need to balance either your strength or your intelligence, then these items are a good chance to do that. So for our belt, again, we're just looking for a rare item with high life, as much resistances as we can get, and if you need to, maybe look for strength on this to make some of your attribute requirements a bit easier. And we move on to the last item, which is the amulet. The example here is a strength and intelligence base. You can use whatever base you need to make sure you're hitting those stat requirements. And on this, we're just looking for as much life as possible and also resistances where we can. And extra stats would help on either intelligence or strength. Now we are anointing the amulet with corruption. It's a really cheap corruption, but it adds a lot of damage to our build. And it takes 2 black oils and 1 crimson oil. So the last part of the gearing section is going to be covering off the flasks. Now, most of these flasks I would recommend running and not changing them and not being flexible on them. It's really only the 5th slot where you have choices in what you want to use. The first and most important flask in the build for me is the Witchfire Brew. It's a unique flask, and what this does, it offers us a percentage increased evasion. What it also does is cast a level 21 Despair Curse on any enemies that come within our radius. So if you can have this flask, which you will, up 100% of the time when you're mapping, then every enemy that comes near you is going to be cursed with despair. That massively increases the damage that they take. I would also run a Phasing Flask. This gives us extra spell and attack dodge, and also allows us to pass through enemies, so it really improves the speed of our mapping, and just it removes any clunkiness of getting stuck around enemies. I'd also run, again for mapping, a Quicksilver Flask. This will increase the speed that you get around the map. What I would do for these two flasks is run a freeze immunity and a curse immunity on either one. And then next to that we're going to run an instant life flask, and preferably we want to have bleed immunity on this. So this with our 4 flasks will give us immunity to freeze, curse and bleed. Now the last flask is optional depending on your budget. I would recommend using a Dying Sun. This is a unique flask that can be fairly expensive early league. What this does is it is twofold for us. It gives us 2 extra projectiles. It also increases area of effect. Now I'll just quickly explain how that 2 additional projectiles work. They don't fire within the cluster that you've already got. It will basically fire outside of your original cluster. So if you take a look at this circle and say that was your current spread of arrows, Dying Sun will just basically add arrows slightly outside of this radius. So for bossing, you're probably not going to see any improvement, but for clear speed, this can really help. If Dying Sun is out of your budget, or you just don't feel it's worth spending the money on that flask, then I would run with a Jade Flask, because this adds a flat 3000 to our evasion that will then get increased by any percentage increased evasion that we've got. And this can be really helpful when mapping, because it just adds an extra ability for us to evade attack. And then the last thing I would say is if you do run a Jade Flask, I would move whatever suffix you have on your Quicksilver Flask onto the Jade Flask, and then change your Quicksilver Flask into one with increased effect and increased movement speed. And you'll notice a huge increase in the speed that you can clear maps with this setup. So we'll quickly touch on the Bandits and the Pantheons. So Bandits, we're killing all. There's not much more said. The skill points come in handy. It'll either add life or extra damage to our build. And then for the Pantheons, I would recommend for your major that you take Soul of Lunaris. This gives us speed while we're mapping. It gives us a chance to avoid projectiles. We completely avoid any projectiles that have chained. We get increased chance to dodge spell and attack damage if we've been hit recently. And we also get increased recovery rate of our energy shield and life if we've stopped taking damage over time recently. For your minor, this is really personal preference, and I change it depending on the map or boss that I'm running. So if I can see from rolling a map that I've got burning ground, I'll put on a Pantheon that avoids any damage from it. If I can see that I'm fighting a boss or guardian that's going to do poison damage, I'll stick on the poison immunity one. I'll just chop and change this depending on the situation. We will now move on to the gems and the links. We'll start with our main Toxic Rain link. Now because we don't run a plus bow or chest, we can slot this in either the bow or the chest piece. For your 5 link, you'd be looking for Toxic Rain, Void Manipulation, Vicious Projectiles, Mirage Archer, and then either Swift Affliction or Efficacy. Now I know Swift Affliction is a no-no in a lot of people's Toxic Rain builds because it lowers the duration, which we don't want. However, because we attack so quickly, there isn't really that much difference in terms of overlapping pods whether we have this or don't have it. So you can either run this or Efficacy, it's up to you. And then for your 6 link, you eventually want to add in a level 3 or 4 in power, whatever you can afford in the build. Because Toxic Rain, all our damage basically scales from the gem, so the higher level we can get that gem, the more damage that we're doing. We have a 4 link totem setup that you only need to drop for bosses, and that's Spell Totem, Multiple Totem Support, Wither, and Faster Casting. This allows you to place 3 totems on the ground, which adds stacks of Wither on top of the boss. And Wither can stack lots of times, so even if it's a short boss fight, putting these down is worthwhile because you can quickly get 5 to 10 stacks, which massively increases the chaos damage that they take. We're also going to be running just an unlinked Frenzy. This is what we're using to generate Frenzy charges. It's a really quick attacking skill with the bow and everything else that we're using, so in under a second you're going to have your 5 Frenzy charges. Then that lasts 21 to 22 seconds, so you don't have to worry about hitting an enemy again. As long as you hit one enemy once within that 21 seconds, your stacks are refreshed and so is the time. I wouldn't recommend linking anything to this, and I'd recommend keeping it low level, because we want to keep the mana cost as low as possible. We're now going to touch on the auras, so we want to be running Flesh and Stone, Malevolent, and if you can, link it to a level 3 or 4 Enlightened, just to lower the mana reservation, but because we're only running 2 auras, we don't really need it. Flesh and Stone basically allows us to blind enemies that come into our range. it also means any enemies outside the range cause less damage to us, and Malevolence will increase the damage that we deal to enemies massively. Now, if you do end up progressing this build away from the Thieves' Torment version and start crafting items that reduce mana cost, then you're going to want to put in a Clarity into that setup and just level it high enough that it allows you to still hit a few toxic rains before you run out of mana. And they're really the only mandatory gems that you need to run in the build. I do like to run a Portal Scroll with high quality linked to faster casting. It just means we can drop a really quick portal and we don't have to carry Portal Scrolls around with us, but it's not a necessity. You could always put in a cast when damage taken setup with something like Steel Skin, just to give you a bit more survivability, but in all honesty, if we get hit in this build, it tends to hurt a lot. If we get hit a second time, we're probably going to die even with the Steel Skin buff, but it's totally up to you. We're now going to move on to a really important part, which is looking at our cluster jewel setup. Now this is where we get the majority of damage from on our build. What I'm going to go through first is the large, medium and small cluster jewel setup that you want to aim for your end game setup. What I'll then do is just go through what you can pick up really as a stopgap, because you might need some extra damage help while you're clearing your low to mid tier maps. So for our end game cluster jewel, we're looking for a large cluster jewel, item level 75 or higher. We're looking at the ones that small passives add 12% chaos damage, and ideally we want an 8 passive, but 9 would be okay. Now what we're looking for here is basically 2 to 3 notables and 2 jewel sockets. It doesn't really matter what ones you go for. The best ones that I've found for your large cluster jewels are Wicked Power and Unholy Grace. The third doesn't really matter. As long as these 3 notables give us some sort of increase to chaos or damage over time, then they'll work absolutely fine. So what I would look for on the market is one with 2 jewel sockets and any 2 notables. If they're still too expensive, we can chaos craft a jewel with 2 notables and 2 jewel sockets fairly cheaply. Within that, we then slot in 2 medium cluster jewels. These can be either chaos damage over time multiplier or normal damage over time. We're looking for 4 or 5 passives. They don't really matter whether you're 4 or 5 because you don't use the 5th node. We're looking for any notables that add damage over time or chaos damage over time, and we're looking for a jewel socket. Again, these are going to be really cheap to chaos spam. We should be able to do them in 5 to 10 chaos orbs per jewel, and then within the medium jewel socket we're slotting a small cluster jewel. Now I don't know at League Start how expensive life small cluster jewels with 3 passives will be. If they're too expensive, then I would just slot a normal jewel in here that's got increase to maximum life, something like attack speed with bows, resistances, stats, anything that we can benefit from. But the ideal endgame setup would be to have 2 small cluster jewels that add life, and then we want the notable to add more life and extra life. So something like Fettle would be ideal, but there's a lot of good notables that add a percentage increased life that we can take advantage of. Now you really want to be slotting your cluster jewel when you're getting into yellow maps. If you're at that stage and you don't have much chaos to spend to either spam jewels or buy them, then we can widen our search on what we're looking for. So you can then say, well, actually 1 jewel socket is fine and I just want Wicked Power and Unholy Grace, and I don't mind about the number of passives. Good thing about this jewel is the small passives still add 12% chaos damage, which is a decent chunk of damage. So if you really can't afford to get those endgame cluster jewels, I'm pretty sure for a couple of chaos you'll be able to pick up one with the 2 notables that were mentioned and 1 jewel socket, and then you just take that part of the jewel socket. You take the 2 notables and the open jewel socket, you then slot 1 medium cluster jewel and 1 jewel into the medium one. You can set that up really cheap, and that gives us a really good boost of damage to start mapping in the yellow maps. Then you'll be able to earn ample currency when you're farming those tier 7, 8 and 9 maps to then go on and buy your more expensive cluster jewels. There's going to be loads of different skill trees within the path of building that show using cheap cluster jewels, endgame cluster jewels. There is a tree for no cluster jewels, but I wouldn't recommend it because we just lose so much damage. But there's just loads of different ways you can look at building your character depending on what currency you've got available. So we'll now come on to mapping and bossing, and also what to do when you first hit maps with this build. Now if this is your starter build, then obviously you're going to have to start from tier 1 maps and build them up, and that actually works really well with this build because your gems will start leveling up from maybe 15 and 16 that they're probably at when you finish the story mode. and then the higher you get into white, yellow and red maps, the higher your gems will get as well, and the damage kind of scales up in line with the content that you're doing. If this isn't your first build and you've got all your Atlas unlocked, I probably wouldn't recommend trying to jump into high level maps when your gems are low. You just won't have the sustain needed to do enough damage while staying alive. Regarding links and gems, you can comfortably clear mid-tier red maps on a 5 link, and it's fairly easy. The bosses go down quite quick. Most of it you'll be able to do deathless, so you'll still be able to progress and level up as you complete in mid-tier red maps. I wouldn't recommend doing 15, 16 juice maps or guardian maps until you've got your 6 link. It just is really good quality of life to have that in power and maybe a level 21 toxic rain, because it adds a huge amount of damage, and it just means that we're bursting bosses down quick enough to not have to worry too much about survivability. We just hit and move, hit and move. And this brings us nicely onto mapping and bossing techniques. For mapping, it's really simple. We generate our frenzy charges, we activate our flask, and then we run around the map firing toxic rain. One barrage will be enough to kill mobs. If there's a big tanky elite, he might need a few, but don't worry about hitting and moving. They will die from the damage over time. Anything that you don't kill, your Mirage Archer is going to pick up any stragglers. For maps that are a nice layout, you will clear 95% of the map without even trying. When you get to the boss, it's as simple as either already having your frenzy charges generated so you don't have to worry about it, dropping your totems, and then just unloading toxic rain. Stand still, every couple of seconds dash to the other side of the boss or around the boss to avoid any telegraphed attacks. If you notice your life start to go because of damage over time, degen, that sort of thing, just dash out the way, stay for a couple of seconds, and then your energy shields and your life will recharge. Your Mirage Archer is still going to be firing projectiles at the boss as long as you're in range, so there isn't really any downtime with this build. If you do need to start dodging and moving and not attacking, your Mirage Archer is still going to be doing it for 4 seconds after you hit the boss. Now, this build is certainly not invincible, but if you play sensibly, you shouldn't have too many deaths. So I like to include footage of all different content on my guides, so there are some examples here where I play like an idiot and I die. They're both on Awaken at 8 Conqueror fights. There's one which is Veritania, where I stupidly dash right into the middle of her, get frozen, can't move, and I die. The other one is Baron, where I don't think I've ever played this bad. You'll notice it looks like I'm almost deliberately trying to stand on every degen ground possible, and I just end up going through too many of them that I don't regen life, energy shield or mana, and I'm basically a sit and duck and die. That one was easily avoidable. We do enough damage that if we kite properly, we'll down all of the Conquerors fairly easily. But like I say, you have to pay attention. If you get sloppy, you're probably going to take a death. Obviously, I went in, cleared him up the next life anyway, so it's not the end of the world. But if you're still maybe mid to high 80s, lower 90s, and you're still trying to get that level increase, it can be annoying to take a death. So my character's level 93, and he comfortably does all of the content. But obviously, I would like to take him up to 94 or 95, because it's points we can put into life or extra damage. You'll notice from the mapping clips that we very rarely take damage, even though we're running through packs of 10, 15, 20 monsters, and that's because of the layers of defense that we've got built up on this character. With our Flasks active, we have a minimum of 76 to 77% chance to evade, we have a minimum of 50% chance to dodge attack hits, and a minimum of 65% chance to dodge spell hits. All these combined make it really difficult for an enemy to hit us. As long as you keep moving, you can comfortably clear content. If you take a hit, that's what your life flask is for. So this is all built around evasion and dodge. We have no physical damage mitigation whatsoever, which is why it's really important to keep on the move as you're mapping or clearing bosses. Now the last section is going to cover off how we can further improve the build on what it already is. So all the items we've used so far are pretty budget. It's a setup that should be within everyone's reach. But what do you do if you want to carry on with this build? You like the Quill Rain quick attack style, but you want to push this build further in terms of either damage or survivability. Firstly, you're going to look, well, the life pool needs improving. It's pretty low, and the higher content I get in, there are more chances of random one-shots. So first thing that springs to mind is that empty ring slot and the fact that our Thieves' Torment doesn't have life on it. So what we're going to be looking for is a ring with life and resistances, and we want an open prefix. On that prefix, we're going to craft that attacks have -9 to mana cost. Going to get 2 of those rings, so that combined gives us minus 18 to mana cost. We can then even put some life and mana catalysts on top of that. That will turn into minus 10. So on our 2 rings, we've got minus 20 to mana cost. We're then going to move across to the amulet, and we're going to look to do the same. We're going to look for one with life, resistances, and an open prefix, and we're going to craft the exact same craft onto that to get our mana cost to minus 10. Then with our clarity gem, we can literally attack constantly and our mana won't even go down. Now the one thing that is missing is that life on hit, which we get from the ring, which we're now missing, which is quite handy. If we take a big hit, our life regen as a trickster is terrible. We have really quick energy shield recharge, but what I've noticed when I'm in serious fights is if I lose my life flasks and I take a big hit, my life crawls up and eventually I know I'm going to die if I take another hit. So what we can look for is on our small cluster jewels, we're looking for the notable Feast of Flesh, and what this gives us is, again, it gives us a good percentage to increase maximum life, but it also provides us with 10 life gain on hit from our attacks. If we have 2 of these slotted, that's 20 life on hit per attack, so it's not that much less than the Thief's Torment ring. And then depending on your budget, there's certainly more that we can do to push the damage for this build. On your amulet, for example, it's possible to get +1 to level of Chaos skill gems, which you get on a Hunter amulet. On a helmet, again Hunter base, we can actually get nearby enemies have -9% to max Chaos resistance. On our gloves, we're able to get Chaos damage over time multiplier. We're able to get that same multiplier on our quiver. And we can also pick up various increased damage on our rings or our belt. They're kind of the areas that I would look to improve. Then the last option, if you decided that the Quill Rain build wasn't for you, majority of Toxic Rain builds will use a Thicket Bow, 6 linked, and it'll have +1 to gems, +2 to socketed support gems, increased Chaos damage over time multiplier, and then if it's a really good bow, it might have some attack speed or some normal damage over time multiplier. The reason that people will use this bow is the plus support gems gets added onto your empower, which then increases the level that your Toxic Rain goes to, so you can push that Toxic Rain gem really high. Now I have used that build, and that was a build that I used to run. I had all the optimized gear. It cost me I think 40 to 50 exalts to kit my character out. Complete all the endgame, not a problem, but it wasn't a huge jump up from the current Quill Rain build that I'm showing today. Now that concludes everything I wanted to go over for the build. If I've missed anything, please leave comments below and I will get back to you. I just wanted to leave a few tips that will help beginners and possibly experienced players alike. First one is when you're leveling, once you get access to Toxic Rain and you have a little bit of currency, pick up another 6 Toxic Rain gems and get them leveled in weapons in your weapon swap. If people don't know, if you press X, it swaps to a second set of weapons and you can level gems in these sockets. This means that when our Toxic Rain hits 20, our 6 jewels in our offhands are also going to hit 20. What you can then do is sell the jewels to a vendor with 1 Gemcutter's Prism, and that will turn into a level 1 20% Toxic Rain. What I would recommend is that you hand in all but 1, you slot those back in, and then the one that you're leaving at level 20, use that in your main bow until your other gems get to around level 14 or 15. If you do them all, you're going to notice that you don't do any damage because you have a level 1 gem. At that point you can then trade that last one in. You then have 7 Toxic Rain jewels, all 20% quality, all getting leveled up. What that means is by the time they hit 20, you've got 7 chances of corrupting a gem into a 21, and they go for a huge amount of chaos. You might get really lucky, get 2, you can slot 1 and sell the other one. It's a really good way of getting currency, and it's also a way of getting that 2120 gem for free. When you get to maps, run every master mission that you can. I find early on that gym missions are really profitable because a lot of the veiled items from people like Elrion can sell for 35 to 40 chaos because they've got veiled mods that people want to get identified really early. I would also say while you're mapping, if you're under level 80, 85, don't worry about dying if you're on softcore. If you get a decently populated map, you can get almost a level a map while you're going along. 1 death, which is 10%, is not the end of the world. And you only learn by doing. So don't let deaths deter you, just keep going. I would say also don't waste time farming a Tabula Rasa in Blood Aqueducts. They're 20 to 25 cows. It could take you hours to farm one. and by the time you've done that, you could have already been into maps and earning currency to buy your own if you were desperate for one. I would also say to map efficiently. We all like to clear the hardest level and the highest level content, but if it's taking you 10 minutes to clear a tier 15 map, but you can clear a tier 11 in 2 minutes, then you should certainly be doing that because you're going to be generating more profit. And in the first few weeks of the league, you can make a huge amount of money if you're one of the first few people, or not even few people, if you're in the top 10 or 20% of people that get to maps, you can make a lot of currency. And the last thing I would say is if you get cluster jewels and you pick them up, always price check ones that have 8 passives and a level 75 plus, because you never know, it might be something that's used in a meta build or a really popular build, and just the base of the jewel alone could go for anything up to an exalt. So I'd like to thank you all for your time in watching the video. I hope I've covered off everything that you need. Knowing me, I've missed something really obvious, so please feel free to comment below and ask questions if there's anything you're unsure of. As I say, there's tons of information in the path of building. I'm going to be leveling this up when 3.11 drops. I will be posting daily updates. I can't stream because my internet's garbage, but I'm going to be running this build when the new league starts, and I'll be posting updates every day about how I'm getting on and what gear, so I hope to see you along the way. Take care.